Hello and welcome to a half special edition of the Third Age Babylon 5 podcast. We are usually three, today two friends who have seen this show either way too many times or at least once or twice. And well, our newbie Meike isn't with us today, but we will still take the opportunity to create a little bit of a part two, a little addendum to last week's discussion on the coming of shadows, because we were cut a little bit short, busy schedule at the moment, but it is an award-winning and very important episode to the season, so we thought we might take this extra time to talk a little bit about a handful of points that kind of put this episode in the larger context of the show, or as we like to call it, the tapestry of everything that holds Babylon 5 together.
An award-winning episode?
Yes, it won a Hugo Award actually, which is a very big deal in sci-fi, especially at the time where it was going toe-to-toe with like the big cinematic releases that were happening.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's one of these trivia things we usually don't talk about so much, but this is a big one. It was like one of the very first times that Babylon 5 really stood out and got a widespread audience, which is something that season 2 will continue to build on. This is what saves the show in the end and gives it as many seasons as it ultimately got. But okay, we already talked about the main plot points of Babylon 5 and the coming of shadows here with Meike. What I wanted to try is just look at a few bigger topics that are in here that will have far-reaching consequences. And as we already said beforehand, we are going to try and avoid spoilers here, but it's still fun to look at these big things and speculate sort of what could this have meant for the rest of the show. Even if we know where the story is going, there is so many alternatives and interesting elements in there anyway. And as I've been thinking about these episodes, it's also always this fun experience of every time you watch this show, a year or two later, things in the world have changed and now things in the show are differently, like very pertinent to what's happening on the news and such. And we might encounter that here as well. So would we like to start a little bit with some of these points? Or are there some that stand out to you that you would like to start with?
Oh, I don't know where to start. You can choose.
Okay, so I thought we might start with the big status quo change of the coming of shadows. Each of these season namesake episodes have something big happening. Last season, we had Signs and Portents, and we did get introduced to the mystery threat. But now things are a lot more overt. We have a war declaration in this episode, and this is the first thing that I would love to hear some thoughts on. What do we think about, this declaration of war being so highlighted and so formal? And I ask this mainly because I was looking back at this episode and thinking, well, I don't know. I don't really recall many science fiction shows that really give you a declaration of war as such. The best thing that I could come up with was from the Battlestar Galactica miniseries, the reimagined one, where Adama picks up the phone and solemnly declares to the entire fleet, as of this moment, we are at war. And even then, it's not really a declaration, but this idea that you have this formal statement of saying, peacetime is over, we are now at war, as this momentous occasion, it doesn't happen all that often, and so it's jumped out at me.
Yes. I mean, if you receive something like that, as in the real world, at least you know where you're at. At least you know what's going to happen next, and you don't have just this ongoing hot conflict where no one wants to call it a war because, that would have consequences. Yes, it was a very highlighted and a very emotional moment. Definitely. At first actually I thought that maybe in universe, maybe it just wasn't the most clever decision. Because my first instinct in this scene always is to think about why are the Narn doing that? Why are they declaring full war? Are they even in a position that they could actually fight the Centauri? I can't tell, to be honest. I mean, just the Centauri without Mr. Morgan swooping in, just the Centauri alone, I wouldn't be sure about that as well. Yes, then again, it's something you highlighted, I think, why that could make sense in our conversation the other day.
Yeah, I think we already touched a little bit on this point that the Narn are very much pressured into this, and it's kind of this now or never moment. But yeah, the fact that you pull this inspiration in from the real world, of course, like this is something that we've seen in recent years, this idea that declaring a war is an important thing, so much so that we've had an entire European conflict where the aggressor side has very much avoided talking about it a war, or at least it has been a major headline 2 or 3 weeks ago when, for the very first time, the Kremlin was talking about a war in Ukraine and wasn't talking just about a special operation anymore. So this idea that whether or not to declare a war has an actual impact, and this is something that people really care about, I find it very interesting that this show highlights that so much. And yeah, I think it's also very fitting that it is this situation where the Centauri are clearly on the offensive right now and have all the initiative, and they use that to force the other side, the defender, so to say, to make that declaration of war. And I think that's rather clever, because if you aren't on Babylon 5, if you don't have the bird's eye view that we as a viewer have, it is easy to draw this line of saying, well, the Narn attacked Ragesh 3 in the beginning of Season 1, and now the Narn are declaring the war, so clearly they are the bad guys here. And I imagine this is exactly what the Centauri would want to use to their advantage here.
Yeah, because the other problem is that, of course, when you live inside one of those realities, you always only have a view on one window of time, and you can trace things back a lot further, of course. But then we are also back now to a discussion that we had about the first regular season, about the argumentation Dylan was giving, that if you don't stop at some point, no one is going to stop. But then again, who can you tell to stop and stand down? The one who has constantly been attacked and been occupied, the one whose whole culture was shaped by this reign of terror. It's a difficult question there.
I think so, and I think an added element on this is also something that we don't see all that much in many fictional depictions of war, is this idea that this declaration of war is not just between the Narn and the Centauri. It is something that is done in the council chamber, that is done to everyone on the galactic stage. I think this is an element that this war doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's this entire community of Earth Alliance, of the Minbari, of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, that still interact with both the Narn and the Centauri, that have to also kind of know what's going on, and that will have to make decisions like on which side of this war do they want to stand. Can they send in independent observers? And all of these are very, mundane but real things that we see in real life wars as well, that this show is just deciding to really put a lot of emphasis on.
Yes, I mean, if you declare a war that formally, and if it happens in that place like in the Council on Babylon 5, or if it happens officially and the United Nations are involved, you can, you have more legal background, you have more safety, and you can probably get a lot more support against war crimes that could be expected on the one or the other end of this, especially when, someone like the Centauri are involved.
Yeah, it's kind of pre-programmed that this is what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, so we can also maybe move on to Sheldon's move, but I think that was before the declaration of war, where he wanted to send his observers to the colony that the Centauri had recaptured.
Yeah.
That was a completely new thing that suddenly the Centauri had to deal with, now that they are a part of this newborn intergalactic community. Their actions are observed, and that there are people from the outside looking at how they are handling things. That just capturing a colony is one thing, that the Council on Babylon 5 cannot just swoop in and stop that and be a military force to say no, but they can still have powers to observe and to see how things go and to control them.
Absolutely, and this is something that we saw threatened in Season 1 at one point with Ragesh 3, but now it's actually something that the Centauri have to actively deal with. And I mean, as mundane as that is, it even presupposes something that we don't usually talk about a lot in fictionalized war, is this idea, hey, this colony was conquered now, but all the non-civilians are still around. Like, conquering a place doesn't just mean I defeat the military and raise my flag and then it's done. No, there's this whole population that you have to deal with, and especially if we're talking about the Centauri, that's kind of the most frightening thing, because, like, defeating the Narn wasn't even done by the Centauri here, and for all the horrors that Mr. Mon and his associates bring, at least it's quick, or looks like it. But now you have this entire Narn population that the Centauri will take care of, and you can probably assume that they also want to make sure that there's no witnesses that could talk about how this battle actually went down. So there's some fun stuff happening there. So yeah, just this idea that even a relatively easy conquest as Londo organized here is still this massive undertaking, and yeah, the rest of the galaxy is going to have eyes on it. It's not something that's going to quickly go away. And with that, we're already touching a little bit on the second little point that I noted down here, which is going beyond the declaration of war. Now we have this issue of, okay, there's a war on the galactic stage. Now, what does this mean specifically for Babylon 5? Because Babylon 5 is a place that was built to maintain peace. And now we can ask a lot of questions. Well, what does it mean now that that mission has failed, that this old conflict has broken out again? And this can be a question on many different levels. It can be very conceptually the level, can this place designed to preserve peace also be used to create peace again? Because that's not exactly the same thing. But it can also be on a very small scale, like asking, are we going to keep Jakar and Londo around? Like, are these two going to continue living on the same station? Are their respective populations, like we know there's a Narn community, we know there's a Centauri community, are they gonna live on Babylon 5 peacefully? And if Babylon 5 is supposed to be this place where, people come together and negotiate peace in some way, do we really want Jakar and Londo to be the ones doing that? Because now that this war has broken out, they have this very personal history of betrayal about that. So that's going to make any negotiation that they have that much more difficult. And, you can also ask, just from the perspective of the project of Babylon 5 as preserving peace has kind of failed. So you should look at that and ask the question, what went wrong? How could this have been prevented? How do we fix this, if possible?
Yes, there's that level, and then also there's the other level that now that it happens so formally and it happens so officially on a place like Babylon 5, there always is the danger of more and more cultures, nations, planets are being dragged into this. That is a level that now is there when you have the conflict there in the middle of Babylon 5. So it could spread throughout the galaxy if you're not careful or however things go. But I think we have to, from the way this is narrated to us in this season, we have to think about if that is actually going to be the big conflict that we are more or less expecting. Because I think Sheridan says in the intro, the year of the Great War came upon us all. Yeah, so is this actually the Great War that came upon everyone? Is this really what the show is going to be about? Just a very actual political conflict that spreads and more nations are being dragged into it, and we basically watch our real-life politics but in space? Or is there another level to it that we don't really see yet? Because that was what I was constantly asking myself when I watched it for the first time, that I thought, this is interesting, and I definitely want to know what's going to happen next, but is that actually the big fundamental thing that I'm kind of expecting here, or is there more to it?
Yeah, and this is, I think, where it's also going to be interesting to see how Meike reacts to this moving forward, because there is constantly this underlying element of Mr. Mord and his associates, who is enabling all of this, more or less. But yeah, the really big question is there more to this, or is this literally just his plan? Like, if this is just an agent of chaos, so to say, then that doesn't really need to be any kind of agenda beyond that. Then it could just be creating these conflicts and just making sure they can't be fixed at any point. Talking about Mr. Mord and his associates, I think pushes us in the right direction as well, because beyond just the war that is breaking out, I think the other big turning point that the coming of Shadows has, as the name suggests, shadows are coming. This is a big step for Londo, I think, and we alluded to this in our main discussion already. He is really utilizing his connection to Mr. Mord and his associates right now. And the reason this is something I would like to talk about is there is this concept in there of power corrupting, because I feel like this is ultimately what Mr. Mord is doing, right? He asks you the question, what do you want? And his offer is, I'm going to give you nearly unlimited power to just achieve that. You want Quadrant 17 or 14 gone? snap with your finger and that it is. You don't even have to do anything. It doesn't cost you anything. You just have this unlimited power, and we see, I think, Londo giving into that a little bit. And that as a concept is interesting, but also not super surprising. What I find surprising then is that we see Londo take this step in the same episode that we get introduced to the Centauri Emperor, and at first glance, he seems like the complete antithesis to this. Here is somebody who ostensibly has all the power in the Centauri Republic, but he doesn't seem like he was driven mad by it or corrupted by it a lot. And on the opposite, he feels so humble that he doesn't even consider himself all that powerful. And I just thought this is probably not a coincidence that we see like one Centauri getting consumed by power, so to say, and another one who is maybe grown wise enough to not fall into that trap. But yeah, maybe that juxtaposition is something to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the question here is if our old emperor always has been like that, or if he also had his times in life when he was more like Londo and just age and experience made him become that, or if he just had a completely different start. I mean, also we don't know much, we don't know anything about the political position when he became emperor, what kind of situation that was, who supported him, who put him in this position of power. We don't know much about that, but what we know from Centauri history is that it was probably a very different political climate in which he could rise. So it could have been a completely different network of completely different people and a completely different person.
That is true, although I never got the sense from him that he is this old man who has been sort of absolved of a very violent youth or something like that. He doesn't strike me as somebody who was reformed after some massive experience, especially.
No, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
That he was probably just got into the position of power, completely different in a completely different political landscape.
I mean, looking at how old he looks and knowing that there is this rough time span since the Narn uprising against the Centauri and that occupation ending, he must have come to power in a fairly turbulent time, at a point where the Centauri were really beginning their downward spiral and losing these big territories and such. So maybe this is what shaped him so much, is that he became emperor at a time where there really wasn't much left over for big banquets and great conquests and such. He was more in charge of managing everything kind of breaking apart, which is interesting. You could make like allusions to late European monarchs overseeing the decolonization of the old empires and stuff like that. Like maybe this is sort of the role that he wanted to go into, and it just didn't work out because it's the Centauri and they're just not done with that level of 18th century politics yet. I mentioned the Emperor also because I think now that we've met the Emperor of the Centauri, the President of the Earth Alliance, if briefly, and the Narn, the Narn are weirdly absent from that, but also the Great Council of the Minbari, we've met like the leadership of a lot of the important races in the Babylon 5 universe now. And I'm not sure, but in multiple ways they feel somewhat remarkable to me. If I think of a lot of fiction in general, leaders often feel like they're embodiments of their faction. I think of something like the Emperor in Star Wars, right? He is the Empire. He has that ugliness, that corruption, that great power that he wields. He's like the personification of that entire faction. Or I think of the queens in Stargate Atlantis that are really just the hunger of the Wraith made manifest and articulate that. Or we think of SG-1 Anubis, who is like the most embodiment of the World and System Lords.
You only think of villains here.
I do, because I have still the Emperor in mind. But if not a villain, then the President of the Federation in Star Trek, right? Who is usually depicted as this wise old alien sitting behind a desk on Earth, and is this embodiment. So the point being, they're usually just a very good symbol for the faction they represent. And then I look at Babylon 5, and it's not really the case, right? We have the Centauri Emperor, who isn't at all what you would expect, like Jakar. I would think the Centauri Emperor is some kind of evil, colonial, brutal overlord, but he's not. He's this kind old man who tried to do reforms and failed. We have Delenn, who is a member of the Grey Council, but she's constantly at odds with her own culture and her own people and the other members of the Grey Council. And okay, you could say President Clark is the stereotypical Earth politician, yes, but ostensibly the Earth Alliance is a democratic state of sorts, and quite literally Clark is not a representative of that. He was never elected. He presumably did this assassination to get into power. So none of the big leaders that we've met are really representatives of their factions, and I think that's just interesting.
Yes, and I think that's just more realistic, because if you look around in the real world, do you feel like personally represented by our government? Do you think that people could watch the news and listen to them speak and they know who we are?
I mean, no, but I would posit that this is something that has been discussed a lot more since Babylon 5 came out. I think, especially with the past few presidencies in the US, there has been very much this discussion, okay, we need to differentiate between the office of the president and the person that inhabits it, because the one we really like and the other one we really don't. And that's been going on all sides of that. And I think, in all the other nations, this is very much the same. And I think Babylon 5 is just pioneering a little bit, putting a big emphasis on that. And that's going to be very interesting, especially as we move forward. And there's tension between these, because Lord Reefer and Londo don't really feel like they feel represented by their emperor as well, right? When they decide to take matters into their own hands, and we see how that is also sometimes a very bad idea.
Yes. And I mean, yeah, it is more realistic that you have these kind of tensions, definitely. And I think it also better reflects how it works when you live in a democracy, I think, because the result you see in the end is often a compromise, and sometimes even a very painful one. And even some monarchies can have democratic elements. You also had in European history, you had times when you still had monarchs, but they were elected, or you had monarchs and you had a parliament. So whenever you have this, that you don't have this holy birthright that decides everything, you have these weird tensions, and it just makes it more realistic.
I mean, this is something that Lord Reefer even talks about in this episode. We often have this very simplified view of it's a monarchy, so you get born and then you're predetermined to be on the throne, and then you look at history, and every single time it's a succession crisis of some sort, because, especially in times where a lot of the monarchs coming to power are very young, are children even, they don't really get all that much decision on who sits on the throne. That's usually everyone around. And now we've heard, I think it's the cousin of the new emperor or such. That's
the cousin's son, I think.
The cousin, somebody like further removed, where Lord Reefer just says, yeah, he's more susceptible to what we want to do with the Centauri Republic. And it's very much this idea that, yeah, great, you have an emperor with a birthright, but his fate is predetermined from the very beginning. And, this is the same that happened to our emperor here. And yeah, it's easy to see how he doesn't feel all that powerful despite his title. One thing that, I don't know if we call that realistic or not, I will let you be the judge of that. But one element looking at these leaders that I never really thought about, but it stood out to me this time around, their half-life isn't really all that great. We've met the first Earth president, he got elected and then died. We meet the Centauri Emperor and he dies. We meet Delenn, and she immediately plunges everyone into an existential crisis because she transformed into half a human, so she doesn't really stay the same kind of leader to the Minbari. And I wonder if this is also kind of one of the many omens or a sign and portent for how this show is going to go, because all the great powers that we see in the show seem to be in this process of a kind of generational change where the old guard is dying out or being killed, and there's all these very ambitious newcomers coming in and deciding we are going to make it different and better. And, their ideas of that are very varied degrees of terrible. But if we look at Lord Reefer, that is really like pushing in this episode, we are going to build a new world order here. it seems stressful. And this idea that a lot of this conflict is tied to this idea that generations are changing, I find kind of interesting.
Maybe I wouldn't call it generations are changing because I think especially our last Earth president was removed a bit early before his time.
Yeah, it's...
But it feels more as if times are changing, as if we are at the end of an era and now something new is about to start.
Yeah, I think that ties in with the war declaration again, right? We are at this sort of moment where we say, hey, we've built Babylon 5, we've settled all the big conflicts that we had. It got kind of close for Earth at some points, but it's fine now. And now we are in a position where things are safe, and something like a big war on, European lands isn't expected to happen so much anymore. Everybody's very surprised when suddenly it does. And I think this is kind of what's happening here as well, that this war between the Centauri and the Narn, even though it's been going on for literally as long as we know this universe exists, it catches everyone off guard a little bit, including at least me as an audience member, where I've gotten so used to the fact that, oh yeah, Jakar and Londo are bickering and hate each other. You don't really expect that to escalate as much, and it's always shocking.
Yes, it is. And I think in that moment in which Jakar declares war, it is actually shocking to himself. Because the way in which he says that his government, right, or half an hour ago or whatever, declared war, yeah, I always think that you also see the surprise in his face, definitely. Yeah. So it's definitely a moment when no one, not even the ones taking actions in that moment, have any idea of where that could go.
And I think it's interesting, I like that you highlight this, because Londo has always been acting like he's just a cog in the machine, right? Like he is just predetermined by destiny to go into this war. This is kind of how he justifies everything. We talked about that. For Jakar, it feels like it's really also a kind of horror that, yeah, he's giving this declaration of war, but yeah, he's really just relaying what the government has decided back home. This is no longer him having his rivalry with Londo or anything. This is something bigger now, something much, much scarier because of that. All right. These were all the big points that I had pulled together. At this stage, anything more that came to your mind looking at this episode, looking at the future that this leads towards?
Yes. I would maybe take this once again to another level of interpretation, to maybe a more abstract level. And I would like to talk about the title of this episode and the title of this season, without having any knowledge of what is going to come next and without really understanding what it means. But it is called The Calming of Shadows. So it definitely highlights that what starts here, or the shadows that start here, that really come into action in this plot, are determining the rest of the season and maybe even a big part of the show. So maybe we can look at that and try to point out what kind of shadow is that? What is this thing, this darkness that now is inflicted again throughout the galaxy?
I think one of the best things about Babylon 5 is how cryptic its episode titles are. And I mean, everybody who's seen the show knows that there's a very literal read on this title that you can take. But even if we just reduce it down to the words, The Coming of Shadows, I think it's fair to say we've seen the shadow of war now. War is being declared, so that is a darkness that is coming. But I also like that this has the implication, okay, there's a shadow, something is casting that. So we are entering a period where darkness is cast over the universe, terrible things are happening, but they are not the root of whatever is going on. There is something more, to the point that you were mentioning earlier. Is this the big war? I think this title is a good hint at saying, no, it isn't. It is a conflict, it is something terrible that is coming now, but it is a shadow. It is an echo of something bigger that is happening behind the scenes, and we've just enough little elements here or there hidden to hint at that.
Yes, that is one way to see it, but I think I would also like to look at more at the shadow of war, or more specifically on what kind of shadow is actually growing in the galaxy now that this war has started. Because there can be many different kinds of wars. And I think in this one we have very specific dark traits of these two cultures that are exploding again. So they have this kind of darkness as the Centauris are these old colonizers, have been the oppressors, have committed war crimes towards the Narn over the years, and with the Narn we have a culture that is completely built around revenge, and they are these bloody war-knowing and war-loving kind of people, and that is coming forward again, and that is also putting everything else, all the other features they have, all of the rest of their culture, that is putting that into the background, because it is about this darkness again. And then if you look into it more details, of course, is from the Narn, from the Centauri. Another level of darkness is a kind of racism, a kind of fascism towards the Narn that now is coming out again, because they colonize them, they oppress them, they don't take them seriously as sentient beings. And I think I find it important here to take a moment and to see that this is a kind of darkness that is now very present in the galaxy, and before was just one of many different topics that were there.
And I think this is also where the conflict that breaks out now already moves beyond this idea of, oh, there's two nations at war now, because the two cultures, like you talk about, the two cultures that are created by the history of the Narn and the Centauri are perfectly complementing each other in the worst way possible. And I think the best example for this is something that we saw in season 1 with the blood oaths that the Narn take. Because here you have the Centauri that don't really treat the Narn as full sentient beings. They are prone to kind of, atrocities that have been never nearly defined, but I think there is, war crimes galore happening in that direction. And under that pressure, the Narn have developed into a society where something like a generational blood oath is a thing, where if one Narn gets killed by a certain Centauri, the entire clan of this Narn might vow to take revenge for it, like Natoth did. Which, as a warrior culture, is a super interesting thing to dive into, but in practical terms, this is terrible, because this is the perfect justification for the Centauri to say, what do you mean non-civilians? There are no non-civilians. The moment one Narn is killed, the entire family line takes a blood oath and becomes a de facto combatant now. So we are totally justified in treating all of them like prisoners of war and enact any atrocities on them, because there are no civilians in that culture. And that as a microcosm of how terrible these two complement each other, I think really puts an emphasis on that. Like these two cultures have spent so much time with one another that they bring out the worst traits in each other, to the point where if we ask, like, what kind of war is this now that's generated here, this has to be a war of annihilation on some point. Like, there isn't really a situation where both worlds still exist, because they are both now more than ever convinced that they're either going to be at war or only one is left standing. Anything in between is just unthinkable at this point.
Yes, so that was definitely important for me to take it to this to this level.
Yes.
Because yes, the titles are cryptic, but I like to read a lot of them as metaphors, and I think here it is definitely a metaphor for one of those conflicts that brings out the worst in each other, that creates more and more violence and more darkness, and that also has this oppression and this disrespect towards another sentient being in it, that this darkness is now being spread out again. That's what I found important to highlight.
And it gets even more important when we remember that we are not on Earth. We are not in the 21st century of Earth. We are in a galaxy where the concept of different species talking to each other as equals was just slowly being established on Babylon 5. So the hurdle of trying to get anything like this through and recognized is all that much higher. It puts all that much pressure on the crew.
But I think for me that was everything to our very long tapestry special.
Yes.
Maybe we could look at some comments and some messages we've got.
We certainly can. I've prepared a few of them. I just need to close the correct window. There you go. Texas Under Shock mentioned on the Race Through Dark Places that this is one of the episodes that were originally supposed to be in a different order. This one was supposed to come earlier, which isn't a super big deal. It just makes Talia's statement that the corpse scares the hell out of her in the previous episode a little more sensible, because then you have a Race Through Dark Places where she gets sort of made aware of the horrors of this core, and then she starts commenting on how it scares her. And I mean, this is just something that I like to highlight here, because yes, definitely there are weirdnesses in the episode order in Babylon 5, but at the same time, none of those ever stood out to me as so groundbreaking that they really affect the story overall. So
yeah, especially in the way it treated Talia so far.
Yeah, I mean that on top of it, right? But it is still always good if we have comments like this that mention it, because anybody who goes through this and will be wondering why is this episode order so weird, we'll get the reminder that it's an issue with Babylon 5 that we carry on.
Maybe we can say again which order we watch it in.
Yes, we can mention that every so often. And I mean, right now we are going by the order that was taken up by Amazon when releasing the English dubbed version of Babylon 5 in Germany. And I would have to do some research to figure out which one that is, because anybody who is watching this on a streaming service in the US, for example, will probably not get any helpful information out of that. So
yeah, and also we do it this way so that Meike can just easily click herself through the episode without being completely spoiled by something or
I mean, that for us is the main thing. We usually just go by whatever Meike can click on next without having to research episode orders or us dictating it to her, because then it's just easiest to plan that way. We had an episode by R.A. Klaus, who as always has been sending very detailed and long comments on everything, and he mentions that every episode with Bester is a good episode. I can second this statement very much so. I always really enjoy them. And I can also agree that he is one of my favorite Babylon 5 villains. I don't know if I would say my second favorite like he does, but he's definitely up there. He also picked up the question of what we would show Delenn if we wanted to explain to her what it means to be human. And his idea was to take her to a local game store to experience some tabletop RPGs. Which I find is a very interesting idea, like having her play a cleric in a fantasy kind of setting to really embrace her religious role would be amazing. But on a more conceptual level, this idea of sitting together with friends and making up stories and playing through them, that's a pretty good human experience. I think that's something she could get into.
Yeah, totally. Now I want to take her to our board game bar in Bochum. Do you remember?
Yes. The concept alone for her to have roll the dice to decide which drink she orders is gonna be something interesting. And you could probably sell her this as a human ritual, then she would not expect any bar to work differently than that.
Yeah.
Another comment by Texas Under Shock mentioned us talking about the Four Horsemen analogy for his wives, and why he might have picked that very human analogy. And Texas Under Shock mentioned that we already know that he is fascinated by human culture, because he did sing the Hokey Pokey already. And yeah, I like that this idea that it's an alien in this universe. Of course he's fascinated by the weird and wonderful world of human mythology, and so he would pick up things from there. I like that really much as a reminder that this is one of the many things that are lovable about Londo, and we need to remind us of those, because he's getting less lovable by the episode at this moment.
Yes, I think, we nowadays also like to pick up stories and tales and whatever from cultures all over the world. Yes. So it's definitely something that interests you to not always pick your own, yeah.
Absolutely. And maybe a small comment to mention, Ahmed Johari wrote just awesome, and he has been consistently commenting on pretty much everything we put out there, and of course we very much appreciate that as well. It's always nice to have a little positive sunshine in there. It's great. All right, moving forward to the comments on our first half of The Coming of Shadows, and that is really a nice little advantage of doing this in two parts, because we get a little bit of elements in here. And Texas Under Shock mentioned being reminded of the scene in Star Trek VI, where Kirk is lamenting that it never occurred to him to take the Klingon Chancellor at his word. Which is, Star Trek VI and this episode, a very good comparison. If you remember Star Trek VI, it's the big send-off one where the Cold War with Klingons finally comes to an end. And if I were to imagine what would be the good ending of Babylon 5 at this point, it would probably be something like this, like managing to go through this crisis and somehow, get to Kittimer and make the peace conference still work and somehow manage this. Another thing mentioned by Texas Under Shock here is that the Under Shock have arrived, as in the Rangers of Sinclair. And of course, this is something that we can't mention to Mike yet, but they are going to play a bigger role. I mean, that's not much of a spoiler. They wouldn't announce it as such. But I do love the mention of the name Under Shock because it gives them this much more mythical, elven-like element to them, which I really enjoy. I also love that they have the little brooches that they wear on their cloaks, which always reminds me of the little leaflet brooches from the Lord of the Rings movie. So, that is something that I really enjoy. And next week we will be talking about Gropos, and then we really get to see the two sides of the oncoming conflict. You have the very, modern day send troops to a desert world somewhere to take a fortress and be like very pragmatic about it. And the other one is we have a holy order of rangers that are traveling the world and going on adventures to getting intel, and it feels much more like a fantastical adventure. Later on, Ari Klaus also writes a little bit about the conflict and how it is escalating here, and looks back on Season 1, writing, despite how much of a mustache-twirling villain Jakar could be in Season 1, his hostility comes from a place of real pain. Shouldn't have to give Jakar that warning. He was right to do so, but it doesn't invalidate Jakar's feelings. And I think we talked about the way Sheridan deals with Jakar, and I think one of the reasons Sheridan comes off as rather harsh to me is because he doesn't have that experience with Jakar throughout Season 1. He comes in here as somebody from the outside and just knows from the reports what Jakar has been up to. So, he doesn't really have much choice to be all that sympathetic to Jakar at this point, because as painful as it is, nothing Jakar could have done in his rage here would have been a solution to any of these issues. It would only have made things worse. But I think it's still very worthwhile to mention that, it is coming from a real place of pain, and it's hard calling that justified in any way, but it's certainly understandable. All right, we didn't get to everything because there's just too much to get to, which is a wonderful problem to have for us. So rest assured, we do read the comments, and I try to keep up also writing written responses to everything that can go into a little bit more detail. But for now, this is our slightly shorter extension to now a very long episode discussion on the coming of Shadows. So it's kind of paradoxical here. But it will bridge the gap between this week and the next, when we will be talking about Gropos, which is going to actually answer a lot of the ruminations that we have on what does this war mean for Babylon 5, because we certainly get to see what it means for the Earth Alliance and what it means for Babylon 5 to be dragged into a conflict by the Earth Alliance. Until then, though, where can people find us?
People can find us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, where we have our own discussion group, as well as on Mastodon. We are Third Age Podcast everywhere. Mastodon is not very active still because I'm still trying to get everything under control. But everywhere else we post a lot. And you can also find us everywhere you can find podcasts. But here on YouTube, we're the cutest because here you can see us.